Today I am going to be working in watercolor pencils. I am using the Derwent watercolor pencils with the exception of a few of the Caran d'Ache Museum aquarelles. You can use these, you could use your Inktense if you have that. The techniques that I'm going to be using will really work for any of these water soluble pencils. Now the main difference you're going to see between these and Inktense is that if you keep adding water and keep blending, that sort of reactivates the watercolor, and so they'll blend a little bit more, or you can somewhat lift that color off. With the Inktense, once that dries, that's it, they're staying put. So there's a little bit of a difference in how you might layer. I do think it'd be way easier to get the bright reds I was going for on the Ladybug with the Inktense than it would be with the watercolor pencils. That's where I ended up switching over to the Caran d'Ache to get that bolder, more red color. I was having a hard time with that out of the Derwent set. So the paper that I'm working on here is the Arches, my brain just shut down, the Arches Hot Press Watercolor Block. Now remember, with blocks, when you want to remove the paper, you don't do that until your project is completely finished. You're going to work right in the block, which is not how I typically do with most pads of paper, but with the blocks, this is how it's intended to be used. And then you can see there's a little gap at the top. This is bordered with a sort of glue or tape around the edges. You would just take a palette knife and run it along the edges to free that sheet of paper. Don't try to rip it out on its own, or you can rip it. So I started by putting a layer of yellow in the upper section, and then I'm moving down into lighter greens. I drew everything out with a water-soluble graphite pencil. I don't like using regular graphite because you can usually still see those lines through. With the water-soluble graphite, that's just going to blend in once I start adding water to this. Look how messy you can be. This is not like colored pencil when it comes to that. You're not going to see any of these pencil strokes that I'm putting on here once I go over with water. Now, if you're using Inktense, I would be a little bit more cautious with the harsh start and stop points of the pencil. Sometimes that doesn't blend out quite as well as it does with watercolor. I'm just going around everything. I want to try to keep this from getting on the Ladybug, but I do want to pull these colors right up to it. Now, it's okay for me to get this green over where the little branchy guy goes in the leaves. That doesn't really matter. I'm just going to put darker colors over this anyway. So I don't have to be super careful around those, just around the Ladybug where I don't really want green mixing into where the red is going to go. Now, if you were working in graphite or pretty much, or even colored pencils, most mediums, I would be much more cautious, I guess, or aware of the way that you're making your pencil strokes, because these lines would show through if you were using regular graphite. But with these water-soluble pencils, and especially with the watercolor, they do blend out so well, so you don't even see any of these lines. I love that I can be super lazy with it. Now, some of the pencils are really light fast. You can find the link of all of the light fast colors on Derwent's website, but with watercolor, and I need to look more into this because there's a lot of speculation as to, once you add water, if those light fast ratings are true. Like the Caran d'Ache watercolor pencils, the majority of those are really light fast, but we don't know what those ratings are once water's been added. I know it'll make a difference as to what kind of water you're using. I would definitely recommend like a distilled water or something that's not tap water for most of your water soluble work. Here I'm just using tap water because I'm not going to sell this. I honestly just don't care that much. It'll go in I'm not a scrapbook, a sketchbook type folder thing, little portfolio. But if you are going to sell your work, do research that a bit more. Do look into that, because I found articles where artists were saying that watercolor, all of them, once water was added, that changed the light fast rating. I don't know, and I haven't done enough research yet that I'm comfortable selling the work, so I'm not really worrying about it. And definitely in this case, I'm using tap water, so I'm really not worrying about it there. But those are things that you want to be aware of with a lot of these water-soluble mediums. The other theory is the pigment's still there, so that shouldn't affect light fast ratings. So yeah, definitely something to look more into. But These are super, super quick projects. Very, very fun. I mean, I may end up giving this as a Christmas gift, actually, to a family member. Just, I mean, they don't care if it's light fast or not or how long it lasts. It's a gift. But that may be a really good way to go, too, because this is an hour. It took me an hour to paint the entire thing start to finish. So, or less than an hour. So, that's for me the main reason that I really like using a lot of these water soluble pencils, whether it be Inktense or the watercolor pencils. Even though I'm still not sure how that light fast ratings or those light fast ratings are going to be once water is added, it's still worth it to me because they are an absolute blast to work in. This is one of the most enjoyable mediums. Both, again, Inktense or watercolor pencils, they both got some different qualities about them, but I absolutely love working with them both. So I don't mean to discourage you, like, oh, you shouldn't use them, they're not light fast. I just personally at this point don't sell the work done with them. If you're not adding water, then yeah, they're good. The light fast ratings should be very accurate. It's once water is added, I've seen too much controversy over whether or not they're light fast, and I just don't know who to believe yet. So that's just my take on it. So the brush that I'm going to use once I go over this, I'm going to take a little bit of a blue-green under this, and it doesn't matter what colors you use what you've got. It honestly doesn't matter. The goal is to have it to fade from a light area to a dark area. It's really easy to get caught up in your artwork worrying so much about what color is someone using. Feeling like it's not going to look good if I don't use the exact same color, or if I use the exact right color, that's what's going to make it look realistic. And it's just not. It's the values. Get your darks dark enough, your lights light enough. That's what you want to focus on. You'll naturally just learn more and more about color as you experiment, but you have to experiment. If you've got someone holding your hand all the time, next we're going to use this color, next we're going to use that color, you aren't going to learn which colors to choose on your own when you do have your own reference photo and you are trying to create something more original. I want you to get to that point, and the only way you're going to do it, pick a color. I'm using green, grab a green. If you make a mark with it and you don't like it, put it down and grab a different green. It really is that simple. Don't let it scare you that you're afraid to make a mistake over which color to use. Just grab one. Grab any one. Try it. If you don't like it, try a different one. I know that sounds oversimplified, but it really is that easy. I think we like to get in our own heads and worry about everything. I know I do. So here, this is a Taklon bristled filbert brush, and I definitely prefer the Taklon bristled filberts when I'm using watercolor pencils or Inktense. To the actual watercolor brushes are usually a bit too soft for what I like with the pencils. So I'm just kind of moving in circles. You can see the color changes quite a bit once water is added. So I like to test, or I recommend most people, actually I didn't hear, I was super lazy, but normally I'll have a scratch piece of paper next to me and I'll test what that color is going to look like once water is added. And this Arches watercolor paper is just one of my absolute favorites. Actually, I think it is my absolute favorite with the watercolor papers, both for using colored pencil and for any water medium now. It used to be Fabriano, but Fabriano changed and it just doesn't handle the water media that well anymore. So mostly with that, I really like it for graphite still, but not my favorite if I'm going to be adding water. It's okay for colored pencil, but I had to adjust my techniques to make the newer batches work. But for water media, the Arches is definitely my favorite. The Arches is fairly expensive, so if you're just getting started with colored pencil or with water soluble pencils, you might, if you're on a budget, I might look for a different type of hot press watercolor paper. This is probably one of the best, but it's also one of the more expensive that I've used. And I get mine from dickblick.com. They usually have the best prices when I've looked. Amazon, they're generally overpriced for paper for some reason. Most art papers are really oddly priced on Amazon. But, look around if you can find it located somewhere. I can find the cold press at local art supply stores where I can use a coupon, but I can't find the hot press. And the cold press is going to be a rougher surface. It still may be suitable. You still may like it. I actually got a pad of that to test. But you may like it for your work, but normally I really like hot press. Just it's much smoother, so it's easier for me to get fine detail. I definitely wouldn't use cold press for colored pencils, but for watercolor pencils, you may actually still like that one, and that one is easy enough to find it. There's a few times I've seen it at Hobby Lobby and Michael's, and again, you can use that 40% coupon. So I'm going to use the hairdryer and dry this. This paper will start to warp a tiny bit. Not bad at all. Nothing compared to like the Fabriano, but it's going to dry back into place. This is a nice thick paper. I believe that one's 100% cotton. Now see how a couple areas where it's a little bit blotchy up above the ladybug, kind of to the right there, you can see a blotch. There's a couple of other spots. Once I blend over this, it's going to blend back out. And so there is one of the biggest differences between watercolor pencils and Inktense pencils. Inktense pencils, once that's dry, if you've activated it all. Now, it is possible not to have really activated all of the pencil all the way, and then when you go on top of it with water, it reactivates. So I do know of that happening. But if it's all the way blended out, all the way activated, it's not going to lift up and blend back out really nicely, whereas this will. Now, that can be a good thing or a bad thing depending on how you work. With Inktense, I love the way that I can do glazes, and I do that bokeh look, and I would do that very different with watercolor. I would try to lift some of the watercolor to get that, whereas with Inktense, I would put a white layer where the circles go and then glaze over it. If I were to glaze over this, I'm going to reactivate what's underneath it too much to get the same look that I can get with Inktense. That probably is super confusing sounding, but a lot of people ask me, I mean, that's probably one of the most common questions when I work between watercolor pencils or Inktense pencils, what the difference is. And that's your main difference. The watercolor pencils are going to reactivate. They're going to lift, or they have the ability to lift. Now, part will depend on the paper you're using, part depends on the type of watercolor that you're using. But the Inktense, if blended out properly, isn't going to lift. So you're going to layer a bit different, and I find the Inktense, it's easier to get really rich colors, whereas some of the colors with both the Caran d'Ache and the Derwent, depending on the color and the brand, it's harder for me to get super, super rich colors than with Inktense. The Inktense just seem to be a bit more bold. The Inktense you can easily mute and make them lighter by adding more water, but they're a lot easier. Like I feel like they're a little bit more versatile when it comes to getting the colors that I really want right away. Now the watercolor, I find it to be easy, or watercolor pencils like I'm using here, I find it easier to get a soft look than I do with Inktense. See how I can go back over some of these areas, and what I'm adding on top as I layer, it's blending in, it's mixing in with my previous layers quite a bit. So it's not like it's just setting on top like the Inktense would. With the Inktense, I'm just continuously adding pigment. Here, it's kind of making it mix in with the pigment that's already there, which is why it's so much easier to get a much softer look with a watercolor pencil versus the Inktense pencil. And they're compatible. You can use both together. There's no issue as far as like with colored pencil, we wouldn't want to put a water base on top of an oil or wax-based pencil. Here, these are all water-based, so they could all be used together. So if you have both, you can play around with that. Like I could have used Inktense to do the red on the Ladybug, and it would have been a lot easier for me to get that bold red that I was working on. And you'll see what I mean as I get started on the Ladybug, where it took quite a few layers to get that red enough. I'm just going to block in some of these loose leaves. I'm not putting a lot of detail in this. I wanted to keep this one very, very basic. It's going to be great if you have never used watercolor pencils before, or even Inktense. This is going to be a great project for you. Or if you just want something quick and quick to do. Quick and quick, wow. It's 2 in the morning as I'm recording this, so while that's not super late for me, my vocabulary is apparently, or language skills, speaking skills are gone. Worse than normal. But where was I going with that? Oh, a quick and easy project. This is a good one too, even if you're not a beginner. You just want the hint of those leaves. And this reference photo comes from Pixabay, so I didn't copy it exactly. You'll see if you look up this reference photo, but you are welcome to use this in your own work, no problem. Now, if you want to go with more detail on the Ladybug, because this reference photo actually has a lot of detail, if you wanted to go with more detail, go bigger. I kept this pretty small, so I'm going to limit the amount of detail that I'm going to try to force into this. But if you want to go a lot bigger or a lot more detail, I would make your piece bigger. It'll make it easier for you to get smaller detail. And if I were going to do this a lot bigger, let's say a 16 by 20, I probably would have chosen Inktense over the watercolor just because I can use Inktense blocks in that case. Not that it can't be done with the watercolor pencils, but it would have saved a lot of time if I were working very large. So here's a slightly darker green. And while I don't want a ton of detail, I do want some variation between the lights and the darks. I don't want it all the same exact color. And this is one of the Derwent water brushes, and there's water in the back end of it, and you just squeeze it to let water out. Now, in between every single time I put it down and then pick it up again to use, I dab it, I squeeze a bit of water out, and I dab it on a paper towel because sometimes it's going to pick up some of the previous color. So let's say I was mixing with red. Now I want to go mix on top of a light yellow area. I don't want that red to blend into it, so I want to make sure I clean it just by, I don't rinse it in a separate cup or anything. You just squeeze a bit of water out onto it and then wipe that onto a paper towel, and it'll get any of that color off. These are, you don't need to use these. You can use a regular, it's basically a type of Taklon bristled brush, maybe a little bit cheaper on the type of bristles. Perfect for this sort of thing. You can use a regular brush if you prefer. You don't have to run out and get the water brushes, but oh, are they nice to work with. They just make it easier. And part of it may just be my setup. My water well is kind of to the side and behind me. So it's a little less convenient for me to reach around to reload the brush constantly. Whereas this one, I just lightly squeeze it and it's right there. I'm not having to constantly dip back into water to get more water out. I just squeeze the brush a little bit, dab it on a paper towel, and then go to work on my artwork. So not really practical for the big area. That's why I use the paintbrush for that. But when I get into smaller areas, I normally prefer my water brushes. And I have some from a couple of different brands, some that I got from Smart Art Box that probably are alternative, that didn't come out right, Art Alternatives. That's the common brand that Smart Art Box uses, so I would guess it was that, but I'm not positive. But the Derwent ones, I definitely prefer. They're really, really nice brushes. I'm gonna go ahead and dry that. If you use the hairdryer a lot in your work, I got one of it's like this little spiral thing. I found it on Amazon, and it's for, I guess, to use or attach to your wall in the bathroom. You can screw it into the wall to hang the dryer, so it's always easy to grab. I don't personally need that in the bathroom, but when it comes to my artwork, I always had my hairdryer was laying on the floor, and it was really inconvenient. So I got that little, it's like a partial spiral thing. Just look up hairdryer holder or blow dryer holder on Amazon. But I got that. I screwed it into the side of my easel. It is so convenient because it's always there in arm's reach now. I'm never searching to find where it fell behind or where on the floor it is now. Now with this watercolor pad, this is such a small one. It actually would be easier if I put a board behind it on the easel. I was being lazy and I didn't grab one, but it's moving around and sliding around more. Just putting a simple, it could be a drawing board or a piece of plywood, anything behind it would make this much more sturdy and firm. So now onto the black areas. I want to have these highlighted shiny spots. So I'm going to take a light blue first, even though, yeah, technically this is the black part of the Ladybug. I'm going to put this on there first just so that I can keep track of where the lightest areas are. So he looks a bit shiny. Taking one of the smaller water brushes, blending that out. Now remember, if you're using water-soluble graphite, and the water-soluble graphite I'm using on this one is from Faber-Castell. It's out of their, I think they call them graphite aquarelle, something like that. I don't know. But they're water-soluble graphite by Faber-Castell is what I'm using. This one was a 2B. Now you have to remember this, so it's a little bit of a darker pencil. You have to remember once water is added, that's going to activate. It's basically like having gray watercolor on there. It is going to mix in with whatever is there. So be aware of that you don't, if you have something you want to stay super white, don't blend your outside line from the water-soluble graphite into the white area because it will tint that. And once dry, that doesn't erase real well. Luckily, the white watercolor pencil does show up pretty well on top of things once everything's dry, so you can lighten things back up, but ideally try to keep the white of the paper clean where it needs to stay white. So I'm using a reddish-orange color first. Now I'm going to end up having to add a lot of yellow into that too because it wasn't quite as bright as I wanted it to be. See, this is what happens when you don't test things on a scratch piece of paper first. I'm going around the black. Now, if you're working in Inktense, if I were to do this in Inktense, I probably would fill in all of the black spots so I could keep track of them first, and then I can just paint over them and then paint the black again at the end. But here, I don't want to add the black in because as I blend with the red, the black will continuously reactivate and blend as I work around it, and I don't want to create a mess there. So that's one thing that I would definitely do differently if you're working in Inktense. You can simplify this and fill that in, then let the black areas dry, and then paint the red around it. But here, that's not a good idea with the watercolor, just because it will lift and reactivate once you go on to it with the next layer on water. Using a light pink over the lighter areas. You can make any of your reds a bit pink too, just use more water, less of the pigment from the pencil. You can see this is not super bold. It's more of a, even the red portions that I have with the oranges, it's more of a pink, or coming out more pink than the red that I really wanted. So while I will layer on top of layer, like I was saying before, the difference between this and the Inktense, I'm just going to continuously be adding pigment. Whereas with the watercolor, I'm always, every time I add that more pigment and then mix it out with my brush with the water, I'm lifting a bit of that pigment too. And it's mixing in with what's already there. So it's not depositing as much pigment onto the paper, which is part of why that's going to be a lot lighter. Now, the watercolor pencils, the Derwent, one of the things that I like so much about the Derwent watercolor pencils is that they feel more like watercolor to me, much more translucent. Whereas the Caran d'Ache Museum aquarelles, those, while they make their big claim that they're more translucent like watercolor, they're actually probably one of the least, much more opaque. They're much more like a gouache, so like an opaque watercolor, than a true watercolor to me. But sometimes you want that, like in the case with where I just was not getting that red of the back end of the Ladybug here to be as dark as I wanted, then switching over to a pencil that was going to be more opaque worked out real well. And then there's some colors with the Museum aquarelles with the Caran d'Ache that I felt were really hard to get super rich colors. Some of the purples I could never get quite as purple as I wanted, whereas I could with just the color pigment was different with the Derwent. So I don't want to give you the idea that one's a superior color or one brand is superior in color or performance than the other. There's just a bit of a difference between the two. And some colors are going to be more bold in one brand than it is in the other. But I can't say for certain, like all of the Derwents are more bold, or all of the Caran d'Ache. It depended on the color. Here I'm taking a slightly darker red and mixing that in. So the previous color I used was more of an orangey red, and now this one is a more red red. So I'm back to that orange red, trying to get rid of the pink color I have here. Now, it would be okay to leave some of the pink showing through a bit more to help make that wing look a bit shinier than what I've got here. But that was too pink. That was too much pink everywhere. It just looked dull to me. You want to be careful when you put the lid on your water brushes, otherwise you end up with what I have there, where a few of those hairs are sticking out to the side. That is definitely not ideal. I can cut those off with scissors, but you don't want to just jam it on and not pay attention to what you're doing, which is what I did there. Or had previously done there anyway. I wasn't super thrilled to find that when I pulled the cap off. So going to go ahead and dry that. And the color's not terrible, but it's definitely not got the bold red color I was looking for still. It's taking a indigo, I believe, is the color there. Dark blue for some of the shadow. A little bit down the center between the wings. And I'm pushing quite a bit harder when I get to those edges that I want to be really crisp. Now, another thing that I think is a bit different between watercolor pencils and ink tints I don't find it to be as easy to get fine detail with the pencils. I actually find it to be way easier to get fine detail with using a paintbrush and the blocks and painting on the fine details with a liner brush. I don't get that tiny of a detail with my ink tints pencils. With watercolor pencils, though, still with Derwent, so same branch, the difference of the way that the pencils are, I find that I can get way finer detail with the watercolor pencils than I can with ink tints pencils. But then ink tints blocks, I can get finer detail than either, which is hilarious because when you look at ink tints blocks, you would think you would just do all, use the block itself to draw in, and that's big and bulky, so that's for bigger things. I use it with a paintbrush and use it almost like a watercolor pan, so I can paint on fine detail with those. Some more of that red. Again, pushing much harder when I get towards, and I don't mean jamming the pencil in there, but I am applying quite a bit more pressure when I get to those edges. Here I'm using that more reddish orange again. You can see the color is improving. I am getting more color saturation. It's definitely taking a lot more layers with watercolor pencils with these specific shades than it would with ink tints. And I don't mean to turn this into a review of ink tints versus watercolor pencils. It's just that I know a lot of people will be using ink tints on this project, so I want to explain the differences there. So you're probably, if you're working in ink tints, if you got in the first layer or two the color saturation where you wanted, you don't need to keep adding layers like with what I'm doing here. So I'm taking a bit of black now and going over some of these dark bits. Now, if I were using orange, like orange, the color of a orange, or yellow for the wings, I would not jump to black for the shadow. But black does work quite well with red for shading things. But be aware of that if you are, let's say you're painting a flower and it's yellow or orange, don't jump to black for shadows. Then you're probably going to want to use purples and magentas for your shadows. There are some exceptions to that. Sometimes you want to use brown, and occasionally you will want black, but not usually. When it's oranges and yellows, you're usually going to want other colors for shadows. So I'm having to wipe some of that color. That black was really strong, so I had to wipe some of that off on my paper towel. Wiping that on the paper towel again so that I don't spread it when I go into the lighter area here. Making sure that outer edge is nice and clean. I don't want that to be fuzzy or out of focus looking. And whenever you're painting and drawing, no matter what medium you're working on, one of the things that you really want to pay attention to is where you should have harsh, sharp lines and where you should have soft lines. It should be both. Any piece you work on, you're going to have a combination of both. So if you're going for something to look very natural, so really pay attention to that on your reference photo. What needs to be sharp and harsh, and what needs to be more soft. And there's one of my harsh lines right along the edge there where the black is starting to be built up. Here's a brighter kind of a yellow-orange color. Now I need to make sure I don't put this right up against the black. I don't want those two colors to mix together. You get this really ugly greenish tone that I'm not looking for. But look how it does brighten up that color quite a bit. So when you're trying to highlight red, don't automatically think jump to white. Well, sometimes that is the answer, and this is going to be true too if you're, like, let's say painting or drawing a red rose. Don't always think that you want white to be your highlight because that's going to turn pink when it mixes with the red. Instead, in many cases, you can get away with using yellow for your highlight, or in this case, a yellow-orange color. Will give you a really nice, a brighter look without just jumping straight to pink. I'm taking the darker red around the edge here, right between the black and that orange yellow color I just put. They can overlap this over the black too. Remember, red and black, not a problem to mix together. Orange and yellow and black, not so much. So here's a brighter orange. I'm just experimenting with colors now until I get it to look how I wanted. All I knew is that this was way too dull for what I wanted my end look to be. Now, with the watercolor pencils or with Inktense, don't feel like you have to blend everything with water. If it looks how you want it to, so quite often on my last layers, I may just leave the pencil alone with no blending with water. You don't have to blend it out if you like how it looks. Now here as I blend, watch that bottom spot. This really shows you the difference here between the watercolor and Inktense, whereas most of that, I mean, that was dry. A lot of this has been mixed, but it'll reactivate with water. Now some of this is not dry, but a lot of the black and the blue, that had already been blended out. Watch how much that'll spread into that. If this were Inktense and that had already been, the black and the blue had already been blended with water, that would not have just reactivated to that extent. So you can see how it'll spread around. So sometimes it's an amazing thing that'll do that, especially when you want something to look really soft. You can reblend something that's already dry. But sometimes it's not what you want. Here, it didn't matter. I'm going to paint that or fill that in with black. But that's a really good example there of the difference between something that's been blended out with water with Inktense versus something that's been blended out with watercolor. The watercolor will reactivate. And here I'm just going in straight with the black pencil. You can build that up first with blue and then put black for darker areas. It depends on really how elaborate you want to go for the detailing. I'm going very, very simple on this guy. Really defining the black here. Remember, that's going to darken up quite a bit once I blend with water. Now, another option that you have for white highlights and such, this would be something that either white acrylic paint, gel pen, white ink, I've got several of those here, that could be something that would work very well for getting a lot of these highlights. While none of those things are good for colored pencil because that's not archival to put a water-based product over a wax or oil-based pencil, you can do that here because these are all water-based products. So this is when you get into a lot of the mixed media where you're adding in different inks or gel pens or whatever. As long as it's archival, make sure, because some of those gel pens will yellow over time. So if that's something that matters to you, just be aware of it. But that would definitely be another way that you can get certain shiny spots. So let's say you wanted to put sparkles like water droplets or something on the leaves or on the ladybug's back. That would probably be easier to use one of those tools to get that look than just sticking with the single medium like I'm doing here. Now, my reference photo didn't really have anything on the black spots. They were just straight black. There weren't highlights or anything. I ended up adding some to mine just because it seemed a bit too flat to me. So I'm going to continue working to try to brighten up that red. This is okay, but it still felt a bit dull to me. And those of you working in ink tints, not going to be a problem for you. You know, when I start to blend out with the water brush, I do have to be careful. I don't want to touch the black if I'm only blending the red. Otherwise, that black is just going to bleed right into it. Or blend into it. I guess it wouldn't so much bleed. It's when you're working with, or talking about watercolor. That's not the right term. So here's more of a yellowish orange color right on top. The pencils that I'm using right there, those were those Caran d'Ache Museum Aquarelles, and way more opaque. So the color is just a bit more rich there for this red. But like I said, I had the opposite experience when I was trying to use purples. I could get the Derwent purples were way more bold, way more color saturated, I felt, than the purple in the Caran d'Ache. So it's really just going to depend on the color that you're going for. And I don't think at this point I have a definite preference between the Caran d'Ache and the Derwent. There's some positive and negatives to both. The Caran d'Ache has better light fast rating, so that's a huge positive. The Derwent, performance-wise, though, feel more like a watercolor. You've got more of that transparent look. So if you're looking for that, then that seems to be a good fit. But again, not as light fast. The Caran d'Ache, though, that gouache feel, the more opaque color, you may prefer that. So it really just depends on what you're looking for and what you're doing. Or you could use them together like I did here. And I still need to try Faber-Castell's watercolor pencils. I haven't gotten my hands on those yet. So back to the Derwent, here's that light pink. Just going to add a few highlights. Going to use the white. The light pink wasn't standing out quite as much as I wanted it to. Now the white pencil here, this is definitely one I would say get a few extras of. Next time I place an order through Dick Blick or one of those, I'm probably going to order a whole bunch. Actually, I think I may have already ordered a whole bunch of those. I'm pretty sure I've got a box full of them here somewhere from the last time I ordered, because it's one that I definitely can see going through a lot, and it's pretty opaque. It really does stand out pretty well. Cleaning up these white spots here. It's always better with the white spots. Leave more of them showing or bigger than what you think you're going to want them to be. I can easily go through and shrink those up with the black later. But if I fill in too much, you can see it kind of lightens with the white pencil. Not a lot. Not on top of black anyway. So if you want it white, try to leave the paper showing through. Now, a couple options you have there. You can use masking fluid if you want to protect the paper on somewhere where you know you have like 2 white dots and you know you need to keep them clean. And especially if it's small, then the masking fluid's probably going to be your best way to go. And you can use masking fluid for anything you want. I could have done that on all of the Ladybug and then been really loose and really messy when I painted the background. But here it seemed like it would actually be more effort than it was worth. But those 2 little black dot or white dots on the face, if I were to do this again, I probably would just put 2 dots of masking fluid right there, because my spots aren't where they really should be. I kind of messed that up. I may go back later with white ink and fix it, especially if I end up giving this to somebody as a gift. That I'll probably touch up a couple of things before I give it to them. Definitely sign it. I forgot to do that. I pushed a little bit harder along that edge. Just really make sure that's clean on that Ladybug. I didn't do that on the leaves. I don't care if my edges are clean on those. Those are not my focus. It's the Ladybug I want to make sure I've got nice and clean. little bit more with the highlighting. Darkening up a few more of these leaves. And you can see how this keeps moving around. Put a board behind it. That'll put a stop to most of that. If you're working upright. If you're working flat on a table, you really don't have to worry about that. And see, as I add the shadows, I'm not just going on the underside of every leaf and adding that in. That won't look very natural. I'm going through and making sure that they're randomly kind of filling in between here and there. If you just outline everything, it instantly looks like a cartoon. Now you can leave it here. You don't have to do the next step. That's totally optional, but I love the look of splattered watercolor or even splattered Inktense. It just gives so much more atmosphere, I think, to the piece. So what I'm going to do after I blend this out, I've got one of those, you see them like, it's like a sandpaper piece on a block. Regular sandpaper will work too, but you get them at the art supply store. Some people will use them to sharpen pencils. Actually, sometimes I use that to sharpen colored pencils if I really want a fine point. They're sold usually with like a blending stump and stuff like that. Now, pro tip, don't use it to sharpen blending stumps. They don't need to be sharpened, and they're not good for cleaning them. Once you do, you affect the texture of those blending stumps. I do not like what they do or what that turns out like. So don't use the sandpaper for that, or I don't recommend it anyway. I don't like what that does for the blending tools. But for Inktense and watercolor pencils, if you scribble a little bit on it, you can use, well, if you're going to use it with colored pencils, you can sharpen your colored pencils on that by just twisting the pencil. I've talked about that before. But with Inktense and watercolor pencils, if you scribble a little bit on that little sandpaper block, which I should have shown here and I didn't think to do it, but if you just look up art sandpaper or art block, something like that, it should come up on Amazon. But you scribble your watercolor pencil on it a little bit, take a stiff brush like what I'm going to use here. This one's quite damaged. Dip it with water onto that area you mixed or drew on with the watercolor pencil on the sandpaper block. And now I'm taking a palette knife and just flicking that color onto my background. I'm going to use two different shades of green, a light green and a dark green for this. And just flick it until you get the atmosphere that you're looking for. But again, it's just one of those sandpaper art blocks, scribbled on it with the pencil, then took my brush. It needs to be a very stiff brush, a very stiff round brush. You can also use a toothpick or a toothbrush, that will work. And just flick that, get a little bit of water on the brush, load that up with what you put on the sandpaper block, and just flick that where you want it to go. Some of it got on my Ladybug, no big deal, don't really care. I'm trying to be careful enough not to get it all over the Ladybug. If I really cared, I could make a little cutout to block off the Ladybug to make sure I didn't get too much on him. But It just adds that little bit of extra atmosphere that I love when working with Inktense and watercolor. But that is it for this one. Again, you guys can copy this one exactly. The reference photo is available on Pixabay, or just copy mine if you want. Mine is simplified a bit more than what you see on the Pixabay one.